Thanks for having me here today. I have an approach when I talk to folks of being, I would like to think, approachable. And while I had a discussion before coming up here about maybe holding questions till the end, because sometimes it's easy for me to go down intellectual rabbit holes. If you really feel like you want to ask something, just go ahead and put your hand up. But maybe I'll be able to cover it before I get to the end of my prepared remarks. But I like to, leave some time for question and answer as well. So rather than me, because I'm often the victim of it myself, death by PowerPoint, I didn't bring any slides, so you're going to still see what's up there, I guess. That'll be ingrained in your memory now. But I basically just wanted to talk to you about what I'm doing, really the mindset of what I have attempted to do during my government service, and how I think that will work towards fighting human trafficking. As was pointed out, and that's kind of a running joke, when Jim was leaving, I have that reputation now in the Capitol. I get all the really exotic, uplifting things to work on. No, I don't. But that's okay, because I've spent really my career. I was in the military, went to law school, got out of the law school, worked for a big law firm for just a couple of years, and then went into the tech startup line. I really felt that public calling. I think a lot of folks that have that public service background, sometimes they identify with working for something larger than themselves. And so that really found myself in the mid-90s kind of migrating back towards government work. And it's been fulfilling for me on some levels, always frustrating, but it's fulfilling in the sense that you can work on things that you really feel like make a difference. And that's something that I think I'm most proud of. But when we talk about fighting human trafficking, the thing that I always focus on when I deal with policy people is you have to have goals, objectives, end states in mind. Too often in government, process becomes the product. And I know with lawyers, that process is all important. How you get to an answer, how you get to a conclusion on something is usually very important. But my time in the private sector and the technology sector, and then with the military, and I stayed with the military as a reservist until recently, and I was a commander and had a bunch of different functions there. It allowed me to kind of blend those two worlds and to see how so often you really do need to have an objective and end state in mind. Otherwise, you just kind of drift. And that's something that we can't afford to do when it comes to these big social problems that we have. They need to be fixed, not ameliorated. Now, how do you fix something that goes to the heart of the human condition? It's very hard to do. What you want to do is create a framework, a process that gives you a product at the end that if you fully embrace it, fully implement it, will get you to a better end state than where you started from. So that sounds like a lot of bureaucraties, and I promised I wasn't going to bring a lot of PowerPoint slides and do printouts and all that stuff because it just kills trees. But the reality is that the one thing that I try to impress on people when I do this stuff is, and I think that's why Pam Bondi throws me into these situations, is because when you go into a group like the human trafficking group, which has a lot of subject matter experts, a lot of very well-meaning, a lot of earnest people, they don't oftentimes see the world like I do, which is, okay, we have this problem. We don't want to just sit in a circle and emote about how bad it is. We want to do something about it. We have to find ways to reduce the problem or eliminate it. Now, working on counter-drug for 20 years, and I could spend a whole day talking about this with you, and we're not going to go there. I was part of the group that came out of D.C. that talked about how the counter-drug fight is not a war on drugs, it's fighting cancer, and that you put the patient into remission. That's a very important intellectual construct and paradigm shift, in that you want to reduce the level of the problem such that it becomes less of a burden on society over time, reducing the denominator, the number of people that become drug users and addicts, while slowly reducing the other factors that cause them to want to do that in the first place. Now, with the resource base that we have, some people would say that that's problematic, but what people don't know is that from 1999 to the late 2000s, Florida went from having one of the worst drug use rates among youth, for example, to one of the best. And that was never really publicized very much, but it was a major social engineering, to use that phrase, victory. But it doesn't get a lot of coverage in the media. The perception is with the millennials and the cohorts that come after the millennials that they all do drugs, they're all, blah, blah, blah. They're actually less drug-ridden than my Generation X cohort was, and certainly less than the baby boom generation cohort was. So large, seemingly intractable problems can be attacked by government, and you can get good results. Does that mean that everybody gets saved, that you create paradise on earth? Of course it doesn't. But you reduce the scale of the problem to society, and that's what I'm all about. So I labor all that because you come to human trafficking, and they asked me to write this report, and this writing these white papers is kind of my thing nowadays. And I wrote it in just a few days, not because it was easy to write, but because I've kind of been down this path before. In fact, I would say that by analogy, fighting human trafficking is where fighting drugs was about 15 years ago. Again, unbeknownst to most people that aren't involved in this line of work, Florida and the state and the nation actually have a very good infrastructure for fighting drug trafficking and drug abuse. It's just an issue of resource funding and follow through. But there's a methodology that you can bring that is very effective with human trafficking. So I sat down with the human trafficking group, which was set up by the legislature now going on 2 years ago. The first year they just had some meetings. So then we sat down and we said, and I have a lot of terms, I call it Christmas treeing, where you get a group of people together and they want to do all these things. And I said, you have to focus on a couple. And then we have to make that happen. And those have to be the drivers by which, if you do that, you get these multiplicative effects downstream. And what we did was we set this Human Trafficking Council up into 3 groups. And I'm just going to read it here because sometimes if I do it off the top of my head, it's going to be all a mishmash. But we have 3 human trafficking subcommittees: the resources and services, the criminal justice, and the legislative and special initiatives. And what I said was each one of those committees should take 2 objectives, and then I'll take the 4th objective, which is legislation. And between the 4 of us, this is what we're going to do for 2016. Now, on the legislative front, there's not a lot of legislation out there pending. I think right now we have, by and large, some pretty good human trafficking legislation already. The question is, how do we make it real? How do we put flesh on the bones? How do we operationalize what we're doing? There's some bills out there in the offing that I really won't comment on. It's kind of a de minimis issue right now. But the big one for us is to add labor trafficking to the human trafficking statutes. Now, when we go around the state and we take testimony from folks, activists, subject matter experts, I think most of us have an inkling. I mean, we all grew up with those stories of the farm workers who, have to pay for their bucket and their gloves. You've heard those stories, right? And then they wind up owing more money than what they earn. Those are real obvious, real blatant. And we all know about sex trafficking, especially underage sex trafficking. But human trafficking transcends those kind of more traditional, like what your parents and grandparents would recognize as modern day slavery. And it's been an education for me because, again, I had a sense that things were probably a lot worse than we thought, but they're pretty bad. And when you talk about, forms of economic coercion, it's a difficult venue to define exactly because, you have to make sure that you don't have such a broad definition that, somebody could say, well, an unfair labor contract now amounts to human trafficking. But so we have to make sure that we do it right. But there has to be that recognition that there's a very strong economic component to human trafficking, that as open and notorious and as horrible as underage and sex trafficking is, there is an even larger universe out there of economic forms of human trafficking. And again, if you follow the international news like I do, this is not an issue that's waning over time, it's getting worse. I think I read somewhere yesterday or the day before that there's more displaced people in the world than at any time since 1945, both in absolute numbers and as a percentage of the population. And those numbers will continue to grow as many of your near failed states become failed states. And you have cross-border transnational migration of large numbers of people. Syria is an obvious example. But as I often point out, and I have a gentleman in the back of the room who, this is his first day with me, who's coming off of the Wounded Warriors Project, who was working the Africa desk. What you're seeing in the Middle East now is child's play compared to what we're projecting 15, 20 years from now. And I'll talk to you offline about that. I'm not going to go into that right now. But these are problems that we need good solutions for up front and good definitional legal frameworks to deal with now, not waiting until things get even worse. So that's what we're trying to do. So what is it that we're doing? I don't want to give you a kind of a dry recitation of just reading to you, well, these are the 8 objectives we're going to do. But I'll give you a feel for them. One of them is we wanted to promote a multifaceted anti-trafficking statewide campaign. I know probably most of you have seen those signs and truck stops, rest stops. If you see something, say something. One of the things I had was, well, if you see something, who do you say it to and whom? It's like, well, you have to work through who's going to take those phone calls. What do they do with those? What do they do with that information? It's creating that infrastructure. See something, say something to whom. So we're working on that. I am all about establishing baseline metrics. In order to know where you're going, you have to know where you're at, and then you have to be able to determine while you're on your way if you're being effective in getting to where you want to go. Because if not, you have to change course or modify what you're doing, or just junk what you're doing and start something new that will work. So identifying metrics. We don't have metrics right now, reliable metrics for identifying the full scope of the problem. So right, you're good lawyers, one of the first things you have to do is define the scope of the problem. So we're working on that. We're looking at how to identify methods to kill demand for commercial sex. Well, that's the human condition. Benard, how are you going to do that? Well, obviously, swift and certain criminal punishments and sanctions do work for a lot of people. We have to make sure they're in place and they're used. And there's innovative programs that other states have done. So there's a function that we have of kind of looking out and seeing, hey, because I do not have a not invented here mindset. If somebody else has a great idea, I'm very willing and ready to borrow it and see how we can adapt it for Florida. But so that means going out and surveying what the other states are doing. Minnesota's done some groundbreaking work on this, and there's other states with what they call John's schools. And so there's a lot of techniques out there that can be used that, again, to use the analogy to the counter drug effort, we Americans like silver bullets. We like quick technological fixes to intractable social problems, seemingly. And what you learn fighting the counter drug front is the same thing with the human trafficking front. There's no panacea, there's no one thing. What you do is you do a number of things simultaneously and well, and when you do that together, here's a good bureaucratic term for you, the synergistic effects will give you a better end result than you otherwise would have. So that's about as bureaucratic as I get. But some of the other things we're working on, law enforcement, there's a lot of training required for first responders. I remember being one of the early guys on what they call drug endangered children. Anybody know about that? DEC, it's a term of art. This goes back to the early 2000s when methamphetamine was really exploding on the scene in a lot of states, and you just would hear these heartbreaking stories of kids that, are being raised by meth addicts, and they lock them in the closet, don't interact with them, 8-year-olds that don't know how to speak or don't know their primary colors, kids that go to a refrigerator at night to get a drink and they pour some caustic chemical down their mouth and they have to have a lung transplant. Drug endangered children was an example of this really bad problem. So I said at the time, well, instead of doing a law enforcement centric approach, what is Department of Children and Families doing about this? Well, nothing. Well, who goes into the homes to look at kids? DCF. So why are we not training DCF caseworkers to spot the signs of meth production? Now, of course, the immediate pushback is, well, we don't want these people to be cops for obvious reasons. Well, they don't have to say anything. They don't have to conduct a citizen's arrest, but if they go in there and they see old Nub has a bunch of red phosphor and lithium ion batteries on a table and they're doing a bunch of stuff, they could probably come back and say, because that is part of their charter, right? Endangering a child, I mean, if they were building a bomb, they'd probably say something. So why wouldn't they say something if they see meth being produced? So that multiplied by thousands the number of people out there who were saying, hey, this is not conducive to a child's healthy development. So I labor that because so often, as I've learned, especially on the sex trafficked side of the house, when they go to seek help, who do they, what's the first contact they have with civilization? It's usually a cop or a caseworker. What does that cop or caseworker do? How do they react? Do they know who to call, what to do? It's basic training. A lot of this to me is common sense, and I'm not saying that people didn't do it because they didn't have common sense, but it takes a certain personality to kind of like try to link things together and say, well, why are you doing it this way? Well, why don't you do it this way? Trust me, there's a lot of inertia to overcome. And so we're taking that same page book and we're going to apply it to human trafficking. I talked about labor trafficking. This is one that you'll find a nice red-blooded legal issue. There's a concerted effort by activists to, and I get where they're coming from, and I don't know what to think of it because I've talked to the AG staff about it, and they have some pretty good lawyers on staff, as you can imagine. But there's a concerted effort by activists, children's rights advocates, who say when you take a child who's been a victim of sex trafficking, right, most vulnerable member of our society, and you start the criminal prosecution process, what's one of the first things that happens? That child is going to get deposed by an aggressive criminal defense attorney. The activists say that that is another form of victimization. So there's a concerted desire to examine the issue of, do we bar the criminal deposition of underage human trafficking victims? I don't know, what do you think? Some people say, well, wait a minute, you have the right to confront your accuser. What does the Florida Constitution say? State law. What's precedent? It's going to be a big issue as we go forward. That's going to be a big fight. And I don't have an answer for you. A lot of it is other states have done it. It's not impossible, but what about the state of Florida? We're not Idaho, we're not Washington State, we're not California. We have our own laws, our own traditions. And a lot of people say that's a great idea, Andy, but the right to confront your accuser is pretty fundamental. So these are the kinds of things we're struggling with going forward. And that is about it. I really don't want to, I learned a long time ago, and I was joking about this ahead of time with Kim, I'm very sensitive, having been in charge of folks over the years, to what we call the captive audience mentality. And that is, you always see the people, well, that guy loves the sound of his voice, and people just sit there and nod, and you just go on and on. I don't want to be one of those guys. So I'm going to kind of cut short my remarks at this point. I think I kind of gave you a feel for how 2016, as we go forward, there's a number of different issues in these subcommittees we want to examine. And I covered some of the meatier ones. So if you wanted to, ask me a question, I'll certainly try to answer it. I'm being recorded here, and people always tell me that I don't clean up so well on video. So, but I have a tendency to speak my mind, and sometimes I get in trouble for that. So that's the other side of me. So I'll have to be very bureaucratically correct. But I will do my best to answer your questions if you have any for me at this time. Yes, ma'am.
I haven't been following it very closely. What has the feedback been of the report that you published?
I am not a human trafficking expert, but people who are professors and stuff just loved it. So I guess it was beginner's luck. And it really was just taking what I'd seen and synthesizing it. I think sometimes brevity has a value unto itself. I learned a long time ago, because I used to write these big white papers when I first came here working for Jeb Bush, and I found very rapidly that people don't read reports anymore. They make, we used to, infinite bind them or whatever in 5-color and take, get this printing budget, and then I go into someone's office and they're like using it as a coaster. Or I remember I did these big 3-ring binders once on these task forces they asked me to do back in 2008. And I made a joke about, this would be a good door stopper. And then about 6 months later, I went to see I shouldn't name names, I'm on video. I went to see a certain staff director in an important committee, and I walked in the office, and he had problems closing his door. And I looked down, and I was like, is that my report? And he was using it as the doorstop. So obviously, you have to find a good balance when you write. And I think for me, it's distilling things down to their basic essence and then trying to find a way in common parlance to address people and say, these are the kinds of things that we need to do moving forward without a lot of, I don't do well in academic circles. I've never had much use for academicians because they usually write for themselves and their 15 friends. Yeah.
So what is the follow-up going to be? Because the statewide council levy, that was their goal, right, to do this report? Is it gonna
The follow-up is those 8 points for 2016.
and then are you guys going to have like open meetings?
Yeah, by law, we have to have open meetings, and we'll have a report card. And it's all out there we can be audited now. I really do believe you need to have goals and have end states, and sometimes that makes people nervous because then people could say, well, you didn't achieve it. But my attitude's always been, stretch, try. And if you fall short, no one's going to criticize you for, well, geez, you only reduced it 40%. You said 70. Well, okay, you win. But at least it's made a difference in somebody's life. Yeah.
How does
Yes,
the
ma'am.
common person get a copy of that report?
By going on the website. It's on the OAG website, and I'm not one of these, I can't rattle off the URL, but if you Google it, all those young people that do all that web page stuff tell me it's on there. And it looks really pretty on there. But I don't want to print out a bunch of these, and I didn't bring one for if you don't bring one for all the kids in the class, then don't give them out. Because I have a limited printing budget, and I don't like spending a lot of money on stuff like that, especially now that it's digital, Well, okay. See, now she asked, you gave her one. See, he's new, he's new. I'm just kidding. I have one extra I will leave behind, though, because I have 3. I always get a couple, and I hide them in my office.
I'd
Because,
be happy to share.
well, there you go. I will leave this one, too.
Teenagers, so they can actually get me where I need to go on the computer.
I don't want to make it sound like I'm a Luddite, but I make jokes. I'm self-deprecating, because then every once in a while when I think I'm hip, it's pointed out to me rather bluntly that I'm not. So, anyway, I saw another hand. I thought, yes.
You kind of, I guess, insinuated that other states have done some things to limit these depositions of the children.
I'm told it's like, I'm not an expert on it, so I don't want this be like, carved in stone. But in talking to a professor at the Florida State University Center for Human Rights, I think. Yeah, that's the guy. He said 42, 40. That seems like a lot. But when I talk to some of the legal eagles in the office, they're like, ooh, I don't know. We have to be very careful about that. So we're going to feel our way along on that.
Do you have any sense about what they have done to limit these depositions?
I should, but I really don't want to. I'm not being cute. I don't. I am. Is that still on? No. I have so many things on my plate right now that I would love to burrow into one issue. Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher, once divided humanity into 2 groups: hedgehogs and foxes. Have you ever heard that? No. And Bill Gates was a hedgehog. Microsoft does one thing. And then Steve Jobs was a fox. He kind of jumped around, conceptual. Ed Wozniak do all the hard work. Remember, foxes. I'm a fox. I tend to kind of jump around, so I don't burrow. Wouldn't that be an armadillo? But anyway, I don't know. But going forward, because I've taken on the responsibility to do this, probably in a few weeks I'll be a little sharper about it. So if you want to give me a call, I don't have cards because I have a new title, and I'm waiting to get those cards. I was just a director before. Now I'm an assistant deputy and special counsel. So I'm waiting on my cards. So I don't have a bunch to leave behind. So.
I know in the dependency court when we're dealing with that side of the horrible sex abuse cases that are also being criminally prosecuted, what sometimes we'll do is have the parties give the questions to the guardian ad litem, and the guardian ad litem asks the questions of both the
See,
state
there you go.
and the.
And see, just knowing that,
So
that's an option.
Because in Orange County, guardians of, I guess it's right,
Yeah.
plural, are attorneys. So it's a little different situation there. So you still have.
But that's a what we would call a tactic, technique, or procedure that would get us to where we want to be. Because again, I worked in a big law firm, and I did corporate stuff and environmental stuff, and then I was in tech, and so I'm not really a red-blooded lawyer. Like, I've never really tried a case. I did some family law stuff on the side for people years ago as a favor. Boy, that was a mistake. And I don't. So when all this, those daily transactional lawyer things, I never really had that experience in the state of Florida. I was up north.
Sorry, I was saying, in Pasco, we do something similar. We also do in camera, where both sides submit their questions.
Right.
And the judge or someone we all agree on just ask the questions to reduce the.
It doesn't sound like, so that sounds like that might be a way to satisfy what we want to do.
I have a question.
Yeah, I don't know from a criminal perspective, because the standards are something.
Yeah, see,
Well, I guess you should be careful who you pick as your victim. I mean, you can look at it that way if you're gonna allow children to testify. Don't have a child victim. if
I hear
don't
ya.
want them to be allowed to testify. I don't know.
No,
I don't do criminal that much,
I'm not very warmly disposed to those folks.
My question was, I actually the same I asked the speakers at lunch. I do volunteer as a guardian line attorney in
Right.
dependency court and the delinquency court, and I keep seeing all these things where it's saying the human trafficking bills that have been suggested by Attorney General Lottie's office have taken away where minors won't be arrested for prostitution, but I'm seeing minors over and over again. Like I said earlier, this girl just celebrated her 13th birthday and was in CJJ for arrested for prostitution.
There is a bill, I didn't get into it, because I asked Legislative Affairs before I came over here, because I figured somebody would be like, well, what's percolating for 2016? There is a bill. I don't know who the sponsor is. I just don't know. Because I asked just before I came over here. But it would decriminalize prostitution for under 18.
Yeah, well, and that's what we're
And-
talking about.
And that, would you be in favor of that?
Yes. And that's one of the ones that we're going to but they actually started that last year where I think it was under 16. And this one kind of cleans it up in some other areas. And we're going to go over this next with you guys, and so you can see the exact language and what it takes out. But it's kind of already supposed to be where they're not arresting minors. And this is a kind of a
I know.
situation to continue.
And I've had, and I won't name names, but I've had folks in statewide and others who say, it varies. I mean, it's a cliche, but not all 15-year-olds are the same. Not all 16-year-olds are the same, even 13. I mean, you could argue capacity in those things.
Someone made
but-
a comment that I thought was really good, and that was that it's a big boat and that we're turning it, but it takes a long time to turn it. But I was thinking
Well,
about,
that's what government officials always say.
well, I was thinking about what someone said earlier about when they do have a criminal record, how do they get a job? And I was like, well,
yeah.
sometime in the future, we need to address expungement.
Yeah,
But then the reality is, you have a human trafficking victim, they need to work, they can't wait 5 years till we get around to figuring out expungement.
No, they don't.
So-
But actions
Like
have
everything has to come
consequences.
together.
Actions have consequences. At the same time, what's the capacity? Again, I have received testimony. I've got all kinds of information that has been thrown at me, that talks about, I mean, and I see this on the drug realm as, our brains now aren't fully formed till we're 25. I think for most guys it's probably early 30s, but based on my own observations. But no, yeah. I mean, all these things, when you get down to it, it's a values statement the society wants to make, but it's also, what are your guiding principles, and those are important too. It's not all technocratic fixes to problems. There's also, what do we as a society want to say about the problem, and I don't think anyone's saying that it's a good thing. I don't think anyone's saying that we need to be soft on the perpetrators, the traffickers, But I've had prosecutors come to me and say it's not always black and white. There's gray too. Even within the horrible world of human trafficking, there's roles played by different people. And I'm given case studies of how, you know, in one respect it's a victim, but in the next respect it's someone who in one instance was actively working to procure other girls, traveling by themselves, so there's not that wingspan of control, you know, where you can say, well, you know, she's beaten, Stockholm syndrome, whatever. She's in another state. So there's gradations there. And I have enough information to where I'm very concerned that we don't, you know, do things with blankets. How do we do this with some precision, but at the same token, how do we modernize and improve it so that we can do the most good for the most people? Kind of the old John Rawls. Is that too egghead, the old philosopher? Anyway, so, you know, anybody else? Am I going to get out?
Oh, in the lunch presentation that we had, they were saying that one of the obstacles that they saw to being able to prosecute human trafficking was having safe houses for victims.
Yeah,
So,
that's a biggie for the AG.
So I was wondering, if you had any other insight on that.
No, we want more of them, and we want to make sure they're funded. But again, not to sound like a broken record, but I remember showing up in Florida to work on the counter drug effort, and we looked at drug treatment. And at the time, in 1999, 2000, it was this grab bag of, you know, drug treatment groups were getting drug treatment because they had a friend in the legislature. And it's like, well, what's the efficacy of what you're doing? You know, are we going to go the route of California and have crystals channeling over a phone? Because that was drug treatment in California. You call up and someone channels a crystal through the phone, and that's supposed to make you better. And they're making a lot of money doing that. Well, we can laugh about it and say that's a lot of BS. My problem is that we never have enough money to do the things we need to do, so we have to be absolutely spot on with every dollar has to count. And I want to make sure that those safe houses, you know, have the proper operating philosophy, good people running them. I mean, even in the last few months, we've had safe houses where every time you turn around, somebody's getting indicted or something, or they're getting charged with, you know, having a dalliance with the victims. I mean, and that's not surprising on one level, human nature, you know. But you know, all these issues they're not. I don't go out of my way to say things are complicated, so therefore they're complicated, but they're complicated to the extent that we have to be careful how we move forward. We don't want to do things too precipitously either. One of the things that I'm very interested in for 2016 is what is an efficacious model for treating a human trafficked victim? And what is it the same for, you know, somebody who is imported from Hong Kong and works in a restaurant? You probably have to have a different approach than you would for a 14-age prostitute, you know. So how you do it, what programs are available, who do you fund, how do you know, who is the vetting agent for that? How do we make sure that has the, you know, for want of a better phrase, good housekeeping seal of approval, that these are good, safe houses, well run, and that the taxpayers are going to see these people get their lives reclaimed, that we're not just throwing the little money that we do have down a rat hole. And so safe houses are super important. They're a big priority for the AG. But as I've learned, not surprisingly, we have to be careful about what we're funding and how we're funding it and who we're funding. And that's very important to me, because we're still, you know, this is a never-ending battle, because on drug treatment, it's the same thing. You know, somebody comes up with a new fad and they want to get money for it. And these economic pies only do so much. And there's a huge demand. You know, the problem vice the amount of resources oftentimes tasked to deal with it there's a mismatch there. We all know that. So guys like me are always worried about getting the most return on that investment. So, I mean, does that kind of answer your question, or did I just dance? I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm. That camera really dissuades me, by the way. No, I'm just kidding. But no, but it's good, because there does need to be a discipline, and when you ask someone who's a public servant like me, you know, you want to get as much as possible a straight answer. But the recognition is that, you know, these are all issues that we're working on in real time. So, but we want good, safe houses and more of them.
Appreciate it, thank you.
Sorry, my question was just that, so so you can have these headaches of how to run them, what do we in this room, what can we do to help get the funding that you need?
Well, talk to your local legislator. This is the point where, you know, if there was SB 555 up there, and I'd say, well, you know, we need your help on that. We don't have that right now. Maybe that's just as well. Again, I am a firm believer in making sure, believe me, not paralysis by analysis, but to make sure plan your work and then execute the heck out of that plan, work it really hard. So I think we're kind of in that formative stage where, you know, I rely on the SMEs, the subject matter experts, to tell me this is what works, because I'm not a subject matter expert on human trafficking. But I've been doing this long enough to where I have a pretty good BS detector, one. And two, I can kind of look at what other groups are doing and then kind of interpolate on my own what makes sense. So we want to make sure we have the right framework. And then I'm sure you'll see proposals in the not too distant future which will hopefully put some meat on those bones.
Thank you.
Oh, I can't take that.
We have a present for you. You guys will
Is that more than $20?
again. No, we made sure we stayed under that.
Keep calm and put the coffee on. Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Time.
Thank you for allowing me some time to talk to you. Thank you. Yeah.